to today's presentation with Colonel Buz Carpenter. He is a former SR71 pilot. He was inducted into the Virginia Aviation Hall of Fame, and he is a full-time docent at Udvar-Hazy Museum. If you have questions for, I have a hard time calling him Buz, but if you have questions for Buz during this presentation, I ask you to please type those into the chat feature on either Zoom or Facebook, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So if we could, please warmly welcome, virtually welcome, Colonel Buz Carpenter.
Thank you, Carla. It is a delight to join you all this morning, and thank you for your interest and your support of the Cosmosphere. I was on the foundation board there for about 8 years, and it was a great pleasure of mine to come out. And one of the things I want to show you today, I'm wearing my Cosmosphere shirt. This was from a SR71 gathering we had there about 12 years ago that was named Spectacular, and it was really a lot of fun to meet so many of you there in the community. And the aircraft that's in the Cosmosphere there, 961, it's a pleasure for me to know that I actually flew that airplane before it went into retirement. So without any further ado, let's get on with my talk with you. I can't see the slides.
We're pulling those up for you right now, sir.
Okay. Well, I hope everybody's well today. We're enjoying all days out here in Washington, D.C., because there's a cold front that you probably already met that's coming our way. And then I think we're going to be into the onsets of the winter time. Our fall colors are kind of half and half right now. We really haven't hit the peak of the season. Well, I'll start talking while we're waiting to get the slides. The SR-71 was a result of the U-2 being seen by the Soviets on radar and the concern that it was vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles. So President Eisenhower commissioned a study group in 1957 to say, what do we need to do so I can continue to gather information? Because we were very concerned about the Soviets' nuclear developments, their developments of missiles, and also the developments of their bombers. And if you recall, they caught us very much by surprise when they put Sputnik up in 1957. We had trouble with our Vanguard program and could have launched a satellite a couple years earlier, but wanting to use the Vanguard rocket slowed us down until eventually we did use a modified Redstone rocket. Next slide, please. This is the genius behind the airplane that you have seen. The Lockheed Skunk Works. He goes back to the mid-30s. Matter of fact, he's one of the ones that he's the designer that identified that Amelia Earhart's airplane needed to be modified because it just wasn't going to be stable in the configuration it had. He was the lead designer and creator of the first jet fighter that we had in the United States, a lot with the C-130. You can see the U-2. Imagine from the contract that was let, 7 months later, that airplane flew, and it was only about 18 months later that it actually flew operations. And it was on a mission over Moscow on the 4th of July, 1956, when it was determined, one, we didn't think the radar could see the airplane at 70,000 feet. And the second thing was around Moscow, they could see the initial parts of the surface-to-air missiles. And our intelligent analysts and industry partners basically said those missiles can reach up to hit an airplane that's only flying at about 450 miles an hour. So out of the study group, coming back to the president, the satellites were not ready to take pictures from space. So they basically appraised the president We need an airplane that doesn't fly at 450 miles an hour. We need an airplane that flies at Mach 3 plus. So you're looking at 2,150 miles an hour as a nominal cruise speed. We need an airplane not at 70,000 feet, but at 85,000 feet and above if possible. And the third thing, which was the most important thing for President Eisenhower, and I'll talk more about it later, America's first stealthy airplane. He basically said, I want an airplane that Khrushchev can't see, because if they can shoot it down, he may consider it an act of war. And you need to understand this was all taking place before the U-2 was ever shot down. The contract to build the SR71, the replacement, was actually signed in August of 1959, and it wasn't until May of 1960 when Powers' airplane was downed over the Soviet Union. Next, please. As I've already said, it was America's first stealthy airplane, not by today's standards, but back then it was very hard to see on radar. This is the last major airplane built in the United States using a slide rule. I hope many of you have seen the movie, which was wonderful, on Hidden Figures, on Katherine Johnson and her team that were because computers were not mature and they were figuring out what the orbit would look like for the Mercury. John Glenn is famous for saying, I'm not going into space until Katherine tells me that all the figures are in fact correct. Because of the heat picture, and you're going to see it shortly, we could not use aluminum on this airplane. So the airplane is 93% titanium. And what's amazing is the CIA put together a frontal series of companies in Europe. We bought all the titanium from Russia. They never knew who they sold it to. Because of the high temperature of the airplane, we had to develop a special fuel. Normal jet fuel, when you and I go flying on a commercial airplane or whatever, it ignites it. The vapors ignite at minus 40 degrees. Because of the heat of this airplane, JP7, you have to get it above 180 degrees. So we used a chemical ignition to light the fuel, either to start the engines or to light the afterburners when we were in flight. A whole fleet of tankers, KC-135s, carried our special fuel. They were typically at 25,000 feet. So we'd come down from 85,000 feet, descend down to 25,000 feet, and you'll see later a picture of this, refuel with them. As we burned the fuel out of the tanks, we put gaseous nitrogen in there to prevent auto detonation. Next slide, please. You can see it's a big airplane. I'm sure almost all of you have been in the Cosmosphere, and you look up and you go, I can't believe an airplane that big could go that fast. It weighs, you can see, about 60,000 pounds. Our normal takeoff, because of the 12 airplanes we lost, 4 of them, tire failure was a big part of it. So what we would do, instead of taking off with a full 80,000 pounds of fuel, we take off with 40,000 pounds of fuel, and it reduced the wear and tear on the tires considerably. It's a 2-person crew. Pilot, such as myself, is in the front flying the airplane. I have all the flight controls and control the fuel and everything else. Behind me is a navigator. We called him a reconnaissance systems officer. He had the navigation system. He had the cameras. He had the defensive systems. He ran the checklist. And when we were flying a normal mission over the United States, he did most of the radio calls to the different centers when we talked to him. Next. This is the heat picture. Imagine the average temperature of this airplane approaches 600 degrees. My side window was about 560 degrees. So even in my spacesuit, if I put my hand against the window, I could only hold it there for 5 or 10 seconds. Because of the heating, the airplane grows 3 to 4 inches in length, 1 inch or 2 in width. And that's why the airplane had to be put together loosely. And you see down there, the core of the engine was 2,000 degrees. The afterburner was between 3,200 and 3,400. The engine actually grew 6 inches in length because of heating and 1.5 inches in width. Next, please. I told you this was America's first stealthy airplane. the shape of the airplane, that the rudders slope in, all kinds of techniques to reduce the amount of radar energy that could be reflected back to track this airplane. And to add on to it, if we took the black paint off the airplane, you can see all those black areas are specially treated. And what they're for is they capture the radar energy and prevent it from reflecting back. Now, even the paint on the airplane is special. Now, people ask me, why is the airplane black? And the first thought they have is because it's a spy plane. Well, it does provide a little visual protection, because if you look from below up at the SR and you're looking against the black color of space, it does hide it a little bit. But the main reason, I bet many of you have been to either in your home have a potbelly stove or have rented a cabin somewhere that had a potbelly stove, and you probably remember it's black, because black is the best radiating color to get heat out into a room, and in our case, to get heat off the airplane. So we're cruising along at 80,000 feet. The airplane is around average of 600 degrees. The outside temperature is minus 85 degrees. So by having the paint black, it reduces the temperature on the surface of the airplane by about 50 degrees, which extends the life of the airplane. Also in the paint, there's fine particles of ferrite, iron ferrite material. And what that does, when the radar energy hits the airplane, it slightly diffuses because of this iron content before it reflects back. Just another way to protect this airplane from being detected and tracked. Next. You can see it's a double delta. And where that where the wing comes in there and joins, think about that forward section, that's a lifting body. So when the airplane is flying, the nose is about 6 degrees up. And what that does is, just like when you're out on a boat, on a lake or a river, the nose of the boat is up because it cruises on the water. This airplane at these high speeds, what it does, it cruises on the air, because the air, even though it's very thin, is being compressed underneath the airplane to give it additional lift. And that allowed us to fly at a higher altitude and to do steeper turns. Now, when I say steeper turns in this airplane, we're only talking about 45 degrees. So in a normal cruise with a 45-degree turn, the diameter is about 150 miles. It's about a 75-mile radius to get the airplane turned around. And when you're traveling at 35 miles a minute, so you can see it's going to take me almost 5 minutes to make a turn of 180 degrees. The airplane, supersonic, anything supersonic is changing the airflow so you get a sonic boom. This airplane has a very distinctive sonic boom, a boom, boom. And you may find it kind of interesting that sometimes we were tasked to overfly heads of state when they were greeting each other, such as Brezhnev and Castro over Havana. And our shock wave was about 45 seconds behind us, and we would purposely boom to make a statement that they were doing things counter to US or NATO policy. The 3 days before US forces went into Panama to remove Noriega, SR71s overflew his home and basically said, you know, it's time to leave, because pretty soon the Marines are going to come and it's going to be a different thing. And he actually left. I think the SR helped with it before the Marines had to take any aggressive action per se. Next, please. How do you like that cockpit? That's why, as an experienced pilot, when we came in the program, they were looking for pilots with 6 to 8 years of flying experience, at least 2,000 hours. I didn't have quite 2,000 hours according to them, but they, I guess they liked the way I flew airplanes. But you can see this is all analog, it's all round dial. And even though you're an experienced pilot, it's going to take us almost a year to train you how to fly the delicacies of this airplane, because you had to be very careful with it, because it was loosely put together, so it was somewhat fragile. In the center there, you see that kind of view screen. That was one of the wonderful inventions that came on this airplane to help the pilot. The cockpit is really small. You're in a spacesuit, so working with a map would have been very difficult. So what they did, they filmed our mission on 35mm film, and it was projected on the center screen there at our ground speed. So it would tell us when a turn was coming up. You could see it on the map, how much fuel we should have. In the back for our reconnaissance officer would tell them cameras on, cameras off, other things that needed to take place to help us along the way, so neither one of us had to carry maps. Next, please. How do you like this new cockpit? When you're reading in the paper, you may have a grandson or granddaughter, or a son or daughter. This is the cockpit of an F-35, the fighter that is now being built for the United States Air Force, the Navy, the Marines, and about 8 of our allies, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Italians, the British. Turkey is a question. Korea is looking to buy it, but it's a single screen there. We now have pilots that have grown up in the computer generation. They are fully comfortable using, in this screen, you can do anywhere from 1 depiction to 12 subsets. And you see it's got a throttle on the left and a stick on the right. And the pilot's wearing this very special helmet. Imagine you're flying this airplane along, and there's sensors on the outside of the airplane. You can look straight down, and in high definition infrared, you can see all the ground as if the airplane was not there. You can look left and right, and the structure of the airplane is not within your sight. It is truly amazing. The Marine Corps model is the one that can land vertically. It takes a lot of fuel to take off vertically, so normally it does a short takeoff, but when it comes back, it can hover and land. It kind of replaces what they had in the British Harrier airplane. Next, please. This is what the rear cockpit looks like. The view sight that you see on the top there, that looks straight down. You can also angle it forward. When we had a radar in the nose, and that was for mapping. We didn't have radar to look for other airplanes or things like that. It was mapping the ground. Our tankers, you'll see later on the left-hand side there, when we talked to the tankers and did the rendezvous, to the outside world, it sounded like noise and static. And in fact, it was secure communication. The ANS panel you see on your right, that is your astro-inertial. We're going to talk more about that. This airplane, we navigated using a star tracker, and I'll show you it in a minute. And you can see the navigator had a lot more camera and navigation issues, so that moving display you see there was a much bigger depiction of that map that they had filmed for us. Next, please. Did they come after us? Yes, they did. We figure about 100 missiles were fired at the airplane. None of them ever successful. Fighters used to come up. I couldn't tell you how many times I saw fighters try to make attempts. But when you're a stealthy target, Mach 3 plus at 85,000 feet, you are really hard. And our leadership, 6 presidents, and our military leaders always felt very comfortable to send us out there. This airplane was designed to operate in hostile airspace. So that nose upper right there, we would be looking, we weren't afraid of somebody coming from behind. We were always looking forward, and we're looking for radars either from fighters or from ground sites that are going to launch a ground missile up at us. And once we detected that you had fired a missile at us, that lower antenna that you see on the left, we would jam them. And back in those days, in the 70s and 80s, you had to guide the missile to the target. It couldn't do it autonomously by itself. So what we did, we took away either the fighter or the ground site's ability to talk to their missile. And in the end, the missile just went stupid and it was no threat to us. Next. This is this astro system I told you about. It's kind of hard to see. I can't remember from the Cosmosphere if you can see the glass window from above on the deck. I think you can. But this is the unit that you see, the big white box there. Came from England. Weighs about 350 pounds. Most of it is computer. Today would probably be 2 Apple Watches tied together. But they would come out and they would load everything about our mission, but they'd also put in a star catalog. The star catalog had the brightest 59 stars in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. And so once we started engines and pulled out of the hangar on a sunny day, that sensor does not see the blue sky. So it looks through the blue sky, it locks on the stars, and within 2 minutes, we are now navigating off the stars. And we guaranteed the president 300 feet anywhere in the world, traveling at 2,200 miles an hour. And one of the, you can see the control panel that's arrayed there on the right. It was purposely built that way because you're in a spacesuit. And so they had to make the controls larger because when your space gloves are actually 3 layers. You got a cotton glove like on your hand, and that's to control the perspiration. There's then the rubber sealer, and then there's a leather glove on the outside of it. So it made it kind of awkward when you were punching buttons and doing things, and that's why they made it a large display like that. Next, please. These are the powerful engines, the Pratt & Whitney J58s, 32,000 pounds of thrust, 34,000 pounds of thrust. It's kind of hard to equate. When I give tours at the Smithsonian, I normally try to find a young man or young lady, and I'll ask them, when you came to the museum today, do you know how much horsepower you were with? I mean, were you in a little Kia, 275 horsepower, kind of putzing along, or were you in a Ford 150, 475 horsepower? So then I get them into a contest saying, how much horsepower do you think these engines produce? And of course, they'll say 1,000, and I'll say higher, you know, higher. 10,000, I said higher. And then I'll say, let's start at 50,000. We'll keep this short. Each one of these engines produced 156,000 horsepower. Back in the 70s, you could have put one of these engines on the Queen Mary, and it could have propelled that cruise ship on where it wanted to go. Now, obviously, you can't run these engines forever, although we did run them at a very high setting for an hour and a half at a time. The back end of the engine there, you see glowing. You could feel the heat, 3,200 to 3,400 degrees. Next, please. This is our trainer. You'll see the rear cockpit is elevated. There were 2 of these airplanes that there were flight controls in the back seat. That's where I sat when I was an instructor pilot with new pilots coming into the program, or your reoccurring check rides you had every year. And you can see when we were home, they tried to have us fly the SR71 about 3 times a month, typically 1 or 2.5 to either 4.5 hour mission, 1 to 2 refuelings, and about 8 T-38 flights. When you look in the Cosmosphere, you see above the SR71 that beautiful white airplane. That was our companion trainer. It's also the trainer that the astronauts use for the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, how they moved themselves around and just kept up their general proficiency. When we were overseas, we flew whatever was needed for the operations and for maintenance. Next, please. We started out with Gemini suits, and we had a white Gemini suit, and we had a chocolate brown Gemini suit. You see here with my great navigator, John Murphy, lifelong friend. And the suit weighs about 45 pounds. The helmet's another 10 pounds. And I also, on tours, I'll ask people, when I'm flying during the day, which suit do I want to wear? Do I want to wear a chocolate brown suit, or do I want to wear a white suit? And invariably, people pick the white suit. And then I have to tell them, well, at 85,000 feet, you cannot believe how intense the sun is. So the sunlight would come into the cockpit reflect off the white suit and all the instruments that you saw there. So it made for a very busy cockpit. Preferred my chocolate brown suit. After a couple of years, this was replaced, and you'll see the new suit called the 1030 that had better air conditioning, better control, and the shuttle astronauts used it. Matter of fact, Joe Engle, that great Kansas boy, on his test flight on the shuttle Columbia, they borrowed 8 SR71 suits because back then, early in the shuttle program, they didn't have their own suits. And if you remember downstairs in the Cosmosphere, one of those suits that one of the astronauts wore is in the display case down there. And just a note, I met Joe Engle. He was a captain, I think, in the X-15 program, and I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy. And he so motivated me with how humble he was and how down to earth and his willingness to talk to us as cadets that I kind of used him as a role model, as a distant type of thing that I'd like to kind of shape my life, even though I didn't expect to fly in spacesuits. It just shows you it's very hard to predict where your life path will take you. Next, please. The day before the flight, you went in and you met with the computer people. We went over the mission to see exactly what you were going to do. You checked to make sure everything looked right, weren't divert bases and things. And then the day of, you came in about 2.5 hours early. You had to pass a physical. So if it's an operational mission, there was always a backup crew. So if either the pilot or the navigator didn't pass the physical, the backup crew stepped in to take the mission. And they wanted us to have enough energy during the flight. Most of our missions were 2.5 to 4.5 hours. So they gave us a high protein, low bulk meal of steak and eggs. If you've seen pictures of the Apollo and other ones, that's exactly what the astronauts were being fed before they went up on their mission. About 1 hour 15 prior, you see me, I'm down in the where we suited up. We each had 2 complete suits. This is the new suit. And it was only one color. It was golden because that was as dark as they could make it and keep the fire protection, because the outer layer of the suit was made of a special material called Fipro, and it's good to 800 degrees. So had we had to eject because of an accident through a fire, it would give us protection for a while. One of the wonderful things now is many of the first responders, the fire departments, are using this. They can't stay in the fire, but it can buy them some precious time. So you come down there, you put on cotton long johns because you're going to perspire. On a typical flight, you're going to lose 1 to 3 pounds because you're breathing 100% oxygen, which is dehydrating, but you're also inside a rubber suit. I mean, a pressure suit is a rubber suit, even though the liner touching you is nylon for comfort. So the suit is laying on the floor like coveralls. You come in through the back. You put your legs into the pants part per se. You come in, you put your arms through the sleeves as you see there. And what's going to happen next, that ring you see on the lower right, one of the technicians is going to grab it and lift it up, and I'm going to duck my head back into the suit and into that ring, because that's where the helmet will be attached. Next, please. Once they get us all suited up, the zippers, the gloves are separate. They put the helmet on, and you'll notice around the face, it's not a helmet like you would necessarily think, because inside there's an inner seal. So that inner seal is tightened down around your face, because the only thing you're going to see there is my eyes, nose, and mouth, and the lower jaw. You can see the microphone just below it. And what's happening is that in that area, from the moment on, from when I bring my visor down out at the airplane, I'm going to be breathing 100% oxygen. And as I exhale, that air with nitrogen in it, very little, goes down into the suit, which is part of the pressurization. Now, in the suit itself, there is vent air coming in to keep us cool. Without vent air, we can be in the suit for about 10 minutes before we start heating up per se. And what the technician is doing here, he's connecting me. He's going to inflate the suit. He's going to check my communications, just like you probably already started there in Kansas. You have to turn the dehumidifier on in the morning in your car because otherwise your windows fog up. It's the same thing in a spacesuit. So the glass in front of our face and our eyes has a heater in it, a very fine gold filament to heat, to keep the moisture, because without that, it fogs up in about 10 minutes. Next, please. This is your greatest sense of speed. You're cleared for takeoff. You release the brakes. You light those two powerful afterburners. And in 20 seconds, you're going to go 4,500 feet, and you lift off doing 240 miles an hour. You'll pass through 20,000 feet less than 2 minutes from the time that you release the brakes. If you go all the way to altitude, it'll take you 17 more minutes, and you see you go over 360 miles. And you can't miss the departure of an SR71 because it's 117 decibels. Next, please. I wish I could take you all up. Look at the view from 85,000 feet. You can see the curvature of the earth. You can see over 320 miles in any direction. Look how black the sky is, because 97% of the atmosphere is below you. And you see that wonderful blue hue that our atmosphere creates around our planet. It's very quiet up there because you're traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. You're in a spacesuit. So if the airplane is working the way you want it, it's kind of like a great ride in a wonderful Beamer or maybe a Cadillac. But it also had some violent characteristics at times. And imagine at night, the sky was absolutely a twinkle because the atmosphere is not filtering them out. 90% of the stars we could see up at 85,000 feet. You and I can't see down, even on a clear night in Kansas, because they're so faint that the atmosphere filters them out. Next. We carried an array of cameras. The big nose camera, which I'll show you later, took a picture of that blue line across there, 72 miles wide and about 2.5 miles. The yellow frame you see there, those are the individual yellow frame are controlled by the computer. You can't just keep having Kodak moments. Those were programmed in the computer. It knew where to look, where to point the angle. These are the cameras that if we were all at the Cosmosphere today and we went out of the parking lot and an SR71 flew over at 85,000 feet doing 2,150 miles an hour, they could take our picture. And then when they landed, and remember, when they processed the film, they would see all of us in the parking lot, and they'd see all our cars. And they could tell the cars, they could tell the difference between a Volkswagen, a small car, a medium-sized car, or if you had a limousine. So you could see the quality of the pictures, but we can't recognize any faces. That's a level of clarity that these cameras just didn't possess when you're looking at the conditions they were working. The orange up there are radar. The radar, we can look out as much as 100 miles either side of the airplane, but then you can't see people, and you see a blob, and you'll say, well, that kind of looks like a car. It looks like it's too small to be a tank. It doesn't have the clarity of the cameras. And the white line down below, we could pick up radios and radars out to 320 miles in any direction around us. Next, please. This is a big nose camera. When I flew a mission into the Middle East for President Carter, this is what we had in the nose. Now look to your right there. Look how clear. Now, if I had the actual film that you could look at, you could zoom down and look at the decks on those boats and have a lot more information, or look at the cars and trucks parked along that way, that area beside the water. You can see the reels of film in the upper center there. Imagine those reels of film carry 2 miles of film. We could film 100,000 square miles of area in 1 hour. Next, please. This is a radar. Originally, radar was strictly blobology, but the modern radar, this advanced synthetic aperture that had computer aids and other things. Look at the pictures on the right there. You can see the roadways. You can see buildings. You can see power lines. These are both these pictures are from Europe because you can see the infrastructure. We were absolutely amazed because I want to say, I think it was either 1977 or 78 when these came in and I was in the program. And we were just dazzled by the clarity of what we could now see from our radar. Next, please. I told you, every 2 hours, we were running low on fuel. Our tankers were absolutely essential to what our mission was about. We'd come down from 85,000 feet. It took us 10 minutes to descend from 85 down to 25, because at 25,000 feet, flying at about 450 miles an hour, the SR71 would pull up behind the tanker. The tanker would lower the refueling pipe and hook it in the back of us, and then transfer about 1,000 gallons a minute. So we took about 12 to 15 minutes to get the amount of fuel. The airplane holds 12,400 gallons. Typical flight was 1 to 3 refuelings. My longest mission was 10 hours and 20 minutes. I refueled 5 times. I took gas from 15 different airplanes because each one of the refuelings had 3 tankers. And part of that reason was 2 sets of the tanker. I went from Northern California to the north coast of Russia. We never overflew Russia, but we sat right on their border. So I had 2 sets of tankers that were north of the Arctic Circle, north of Norway. So they had to fly 6 hours to get to where I needed them. So if I'd only taken fuel from, if one of the tankers couldn't pass fuel and I took fuel from the other 2, they wouldn't have enough fuel to get back home. So they would have landed in Norway, which wouldn't have been too bad because the Norwegians wouldn't have been excited about an Air Force tanker landing on there. We had some missions when SRs had operational difficulties, maintenance difficulties, and landed in Norway. And the presence of an SR71 normally brought quite a bit of attention. Next, please. These are all the trouble spots. You see our home base to the far left. That's where our families were. That's where we trained. The blue in the center up above, Northern Europe, that's at Mildenhall, about 2 hours outside of London in East Anglia. All the red circles represent areas that were of great interest to us where we did a lot of work. The blue to your right is Kadena Air Base, Okinawa, Japan. And that X in the middle of the Indian Ocean, that's Diego Garcia. I'm only one of 2 pilots that ever took the SR-71 into Diego Garcia. We were going to fly it from there up to cover Iran, come from Iran from a different direction. We never did. The Iranian missions that were flown actually came out of Okinawa. They were long flights, 11 hours and about 20 minutes. A funny story, when I went into Diego Garcia, I took off out of Japan, flew across, they had clearance across lower Thailand. We entered the Indian Ocean, and as we approached the equator, they had loaded the Northern Star catalog. So everything was looking fine. As we were approaching the equator, all of a sudden we had no navigation. The star tracker couldn't work. So now we're looking at dead reckoning to find a little island in the middle of, which was about 900 miles ahead of us. Now there were some electronic things we could do. So when we landed there, they were asking us how everything went. And I looked at the technicians and I kind of said, well, we lost our navigation around the equator. And my navigator and I looked at him and said, did you guys remember to load the Southern Star catalog in also? They completely forgot that Diego Garcia is 4.5 degrees south of the equator. So once we passed the equator, they couldn't find any stars. The next day or 2 days later, when I returned back to Japan, they didn't bring the Southern Star catalog with them. So what they did said, well, why don't you take off, climb up over Diego Garcia, and take up a northeastern heading, because I think when you cross the equator, it'll see the stars again and get you back to Japan. It was one of those, funny stories that happens. Next, please. You come into land, it's very fast. You touch down doing 175 miles an hour. You deploy this drag chute. Without the drag chute, it takes about 10,000 feet of runway. You can see when the drag chute comes out, you come to pretty close to a stop in 4,000 to 5,000 feet, and you reduce the wear and tear on the tires per se. Next, please. The film is downloaded. It's taken into the darkroom. It's cut into 500-foot lengths. With cotton surgical gloves, you go the whole length of the film to make sure there's no tears, nicks, or anything else that would cause the film to become jammed when you put it into the film processor. Because the last thing you want is having executed a mission, collected the pictures you wanted, and then have the film lost because it got jammed in the processor. Next. This is the final picture of the fleet as it's being retired, 1990. You can see there's 10 operational airplanes. That's what we normally had out, with the rest of them would be in storage. And in the back there, the last airplane, number 11, that's the trainer with that elevated rear cockpit. We'd upgraded the airplane through the 80s. There was nothing wrong with the airplane. The Cold War came to an end, so they made a decision. They felt an airplane that can fly in very hostile airspace, it's going to be a much more peaceful world. We don't need it. It was costing $85,000 an hour to operate because of the SR maintenance, because of our tankers, because of all the special things that went with it. Compared to satellites, it was still, satellites are not inexpensive. But I think the real main point, when I flew my mission for President Carter, which he monitored from the Oval Office, and I landed back in England, they had to download the cameras and the recorders, put it in a waiting airplane, fly it across the Atlantic. Let's say that's a 7-hour flight, maybe. Process the film and the data in Washington, D.C., and then deliver it to the president, trying to render decisions on a conflict taking place in the Arabian Peninsula. That's not the world we live in. Think about it. I bet most of you that I'm talking to today have smartphones. You take a picture, you clip it, and you send it to a friend half the world away in a couple minutes. Our leaders today, our president in particular, they're looking for information, hopefully in 10 minutes or less, that's been relayed to them via satellites or via other means, because it's a fast-paced world we live in, and they want to have the data so they can render the decisions. Well, this concludes this. I'm very much looking forward to the questions that you might have.
So we do have some really great questions here for you, Buzz.
Wonderful.
If you have a question that you'd like to ask, please type it into the chat feature on either Zoom or Facebook, and we will ask that. The first question I wanted to ask you came from a viewer today, and it was, what country, sir, made you the most scared to fly over?
Well, we didn't overfly Russia or China, but they had the greatest capability, particularly Russia. With their MiG-25 fighters, they couldn't quite get up to our altitude, and they could get to Mach 3, but when they got up there, they basically burned up their engines. The pilot could get the airplane back to the base, but the engines had to be replaced. Some of our most difficult missions, and it's less threat-driven, the State Department would tell us, as part of the guidance, what we could and couldn't do. And in many ways, a peripheral mission could be more demanding. I had a major emergency on the DMZ with North Korea. And what I needed to do was roll the airplane out because the airplane was going unstable. But if I'd rolled the airplane out, I would have overflown North Korea, which would have been potentially a political issue for the president and leaders to deal with. So I had to nurse the airplane through a turn. It was damaged, but I successfully recovered it at a U.S. Air Force base in South Korea, and then maintenance could come up and fix it.
Wow, just some phenomenal stories. We have a lot of folks thanking you for your service as well, so I wanted to be sure to pass that message along.
It was my pleasure, believe me.
Uh, and following on that, how many SR-71 pilots were there in the program in your era, sir?
When I was flying, there were only 11 of us. At any time, that's about the number that were active, currently flying the airplane. Through the 25 years of the program, only 85 pilots and about 86 navigators ever flew the airplane operationally. We had about 3,600 operational missions supporting taskings from the military, from NATO, and from the president.
So to say you were part of an elite group isn't an exaggeration then.
Carla, we kid the astronauts. We said, hey, you folks are up to over 500 astronauts. There's only 85 of us. Who's in the more exclusive club?
Who's more special? That's right. We know that the SR-71 was sold to the public originally as a weather plane. Is that correct?
The U-2 was. The SR-71 was always sold as a reconnaissance airplane. By that time, they felt comfortable. It was secret for a long time. I mean, in the 60s, if you had landed away somewhere, security was there. Well, security was there always. When I landed with an airplane, that emergency in Korea, basically, I called out where I was going to divert to, and the base was called. It happened to be a base that had a general officer at, and he was basically told that whatever I needed to fulfill my wishes. That's why you had to be kind of careful. I was a captain, you know, let's not overstep your bounds per se. But he met me at the airplane. The guards were already there, and we put it in the hangar and waited for our maintenance to come up and fix the airplane so we could fly it home.
Wow. Can you tell us, are you allowed to tell us about your longest flight or your highest altitude?
My highest altitude, we weren't supposed to go above 85,000, but we all went above 85,000 just to say we did it. Later in the program, they were flying off the north coast of Russia more often, and they were getting into very cold air. And so the airplane was commonly up 87,000 feet because of the density of the air. My longest mission was the one from Northern California, emergency, to fly to the north coast of Russia and look at their submarine pins using our radar, because the Navy had lost track of a couple of their boomers. Those were their missile submarines, and they're trying to figure out where they were. And we could shine our radar into Murmansk there and look for which submarines were home and which of the sub pins were empty. So that was over 15,000 miles, and the 5 refuelings I told you about, they think I probably consumed over 72,000 gallons of fuel. But the limiting factor was getting our tankers out there because they flew at a normal speed. So I could close at Mach 3, but the tankers had to be in position. The first tankers were over Idaho. The second set of tankers were over Goose Bay, Labrador. The third and fourth set were over north of Norway. The set that had come up from Goose Bay, Labrador landed, refueled, and came back up to refuel me as I was heading home.
Wow. That's pretty fabulous. Can you tell us, what did the sonic boom feel like as a pilot of the SR-71?
You had no feeling at all. Matter of fact, many of you watching probably remember those old movies where the airplane would shake and they would look at the gauges and, okay, yes, we're supersonic. This airplane was so powerful that what we would do, we'd climb up to about 33,000 after we came off the tanker, and then push the nose over, and then light the afterburners, and we stayed above 30,000 feet because the sonic boom can be destructive. So we tried to reduce the sound effects on the ground, and we would very quickly go through the sound the sound barrier, and the air would align itself. To kind of give you an idea, on one mission I flew over Cuba, and the mission was over. I came back. I was making a descending turn into Mississippi, to refuel so I could come home. Well, when I got back home, my boss, a couple levels up, a colonel, I was still a captain at that point, called me, just after I got out of my spacesuit, and said, "How'd the mission go?" And I said, "Colonel Lawson, you don't call unless there's," I said, "I flew it exactly as planned." And he kind of chuckled a little bit and said, "Well, Hattiesburg, Mississippi has about 30 homes that have fewer windows now. And what we've learned since then is that when you're in a turn coming down, sometimes that shock wave concentrates from London to Los Angeles in 3 hours and 47 minutes. As it was making a turn over Los Angeles, it broke windows in about 20 homes, including Zaza Gabor's. And the Air Force thought they would do something for publicity. So they sent the pilot, navigator, and their wives down to LA to personally apologize to Zaza Gabor. Now, I don't know if she came out or she sent the butler out, but she asked that the pilot and the navigator come in and visit with her, and the ladies could stay in the car. She obviously didn't want any competition.
Oh my. Wow, what a fabulous story. Okay, the other day when we were testing, sir, you told us the story of how you became involved with the SR71 program, and it has a tie here to our local astronaut. Would you tell us about your interaction with Joe Engle?
When I was a cadet, I did like a summer internship at Edwards Air Force Base. And at that time, they were just starting to test the SR71. So it was there. But that's also where I met, and I believe he was a captain at the time, Joe Engle, who was from Kansas and was one of our early X-15 pilots, became an astronaut with the X-15 program. But he was so engaging and so motivating, you know, telling not only myself, but there were a couple other cadets with me doing this internship on, you know, dare to dream and pursue those dreams. You just don't know. And that's kind of a theme that I try to pass on to young men and women now, that don't be afraid to think those big thoughts and then try to figure out what do I have to do to try to get there. Because you never know. Because when I graduated from the Air Force Academy, an SR-71 flew over for our graduation. It was a magnificent sight. If you had asked me that day if I would ever fly that airplane, I would have unequivocally said no, because I was really more of an international affairs major. I took all the science courses because you had to. Congress requires it. But 8 years later, I'm in the program. You know, so you just never know.
It's a really small world once you get into it. Is that correct?
That is correct. That is very correct. When we did the Apollo 45 celebration at the Cosmosphere, I was lucky enough to escort Fred Heisey around. What a wonderful, wonderful man, and the work he was doing in his home state there. But he had a chuckle one day, and he looked at me and said, "You know, I'm jealous of you." And I go, "Fred, how could you be jealous of me?" He said, "I only got into space, I think it was twice. How many times did you fly the SR-71? I said, "Over 200. He said, "I rest my case."
Fabulous. Yeah, that's right. Every time, right?
That's right.
Could you tell us about one of the most dangerous situations or the worst situation you found yourself in as a pilot of the SR-71?
We flew what we call coordinated missions. And that's when the SR-71 was really the bait for the Soviets. And we would come at them in a provocative way. We would not overfly them. But at the same time, there'd be satellites overhead. There'd be other airplanes in the sky. There'd be ships at sea. This is in the far eastern part near Vladivostok, and ground sites. And this particular mission, there were going to be 28 different systems watching me stimulate the Soviets, because they reacted to the airplane. There was something about it that they really wanted to get a shot at it that they were never able to do. So a lot of the radars and radio frequencies that other airplanes trying to collect information would never see when we would go through. This particular day, it had all been set up. The weather at Okinawa was absolutely terrible. Fortunately, our tankers got off. It was so terrible, the driving tropical rain. The first airplane that went out, I was in the backup airplane. I wasn't even the primary. And those sheets of water coming down, all of a sudden we hear the primary airplane has a maintenance problem. You're now going. I get out there, and I can't hardly see down the runway. So I call the ops, and I said, okay, what do you want to do? And the word came back, said, Washington says, if you can get off, get off. So I took off between a squall line. I could see about 100, 150 yards. I was able to get the airplane up and refueled. But then when I came off the tanker, one of my afterburners wouldn't work. So now I had to dump fuel and come back in to the airfield I just left that had been closed because of weather. And so the airplane didn't like heavy rain because it was loosely put together. Sometimes water would get into places and you'd start having loss of problems. So I started having instruments that weren't exactly looking right. So I'm doing a radar approach. I come down, I break out of a low ceiling, and the radar controller has put me on the wrong runway. And there's a DC-10 with, I think, Cambodian refugees on it. So I have to go around. At this time, my attitude indicator fails. Fortunately, I knew this base well enough because I'd flown out of there for 3 years before I came in the SR program and flew out of there. So I had to navigate underneath the weather by kind of looking at the ground, and parts of the time I was navigating to come back around and do a visual approach because the radar guy they fired on or they relieved on the spot. So I had to, and you're in a spacesuit, the visibility is not great. So I came around and I got the airplane on the ground. But when I finally got into the hangar, I looked at the commander and I said, let's not do that again. And I want a beer. Next.
Absolutely. All right. Can you tell us when you found out that the SR71 was going to be declassified, were you able to talk about it?
Matter of fact, Carla, I was in Washington, D.C., and the CIA, I think it may have been 1 or 2 Air Force people on it, but it was mostly CIA, had all the documents. I actually spent at least half a day, it may have been a whole day, with them, talking to them about what they should be looking at in declassification, what they should be concerned about. Because Joe Smith and John Dokes flew a mission wherever on a certain day, you know, that's history. There really isn't any sensitivity to it. But when you start looking at some of the capabilities that were still how our defensive systems worked, how we went about building an airplane in secrecy that the Soviets wouldn't know about until we used it. Kind of like later on in Desert Storm. The Iraqis had no idea what to do with the 117. They never saw it. The 117 was the one that dropped the bombs on Baghdad because it could go in and out. And a couple of the guys that worked for me were some of the interrogators of some of the Iraqi generals. And they readily admitted the only way we knew that those stealthy airplanes were up there was things started blowing up. We had no idea. We just fired into the sky hoping we might hit something, which they didn't. But so I met with them, and over a I think it took them about a year or so. And I was already comfortable talking about the things that I knew wouldn't be sensitive, but it helped once the CIA got through that we could expand it more to some of the development things, some of the stories that we can now tell that at the time they were a little sensitive about. And it's fun now because I can talk to people about it, and I can share with my 3 daughters so they can understand better what their dad was doing when they were there in Northern California and I was somewhere in the world.
Yeah, that would have been difficult, I would imagine. So, I do have a couple more questions. I know that we are technically over time here, but if you wouldn't mind answering just a couple more here.
Sure.
Would you tell us about your favorite flight?
Probably the most interesting flight was the one I flew for President Carter when basically he was going to monitor the flight from the Oval Office. We normally ran the operational missions radio silent, but again, Carter was a control freak. And so after each refueling, he wanted us to break radio silent, his staff did, and make a radio call that everything was okay. And what you have to understand about this was a very special mission because there was a war taking place between the Saudis and the Yemenis. It was quick reaction. All of a sudden, we got tasking. Friday, Saturday night at a gathering, the colonel in charge of operations said, after church tomorrow morning, bring your navigator in, go to the vault because we got some maps that we want you to look at. Carla, I got a call at 7 in the morning, says, get your navigator now and get down here. We are deploying. So we went down, we looked at the mission. John and I knew, okay, we're going to the Middle East. The British had never allowed us to fly out of the Middle East, out of England before, into the Middle East and land there. They're always afraid of an oil embargo. So basically, because of this conflict, and now they had the North Field was giving them oil, so they were more comfortable. We were going to deploy quickly on Sunday, an SR71 to England to fly missions out of there into the Middle East to collect information, photographic information, particularly for President Carter and his staff to figure out what they could do to help defuse this conflict per se. So John and I go over in tankers. The senior crew brings the airplane over. We go in on, I think it was Tuesday, because it took a while for our tankers. They had tried to figure out where should we put our tankers. It turns out some of the tankers went to Spain. 2 sets of tankers went to Cairo to be able to refuel us because it's going to be 5 refuelings because the French wouldn't let us overfly. So we go into the meeting and we come in there and it's not our standard operational meeting. The 2-star general in charge of operations for Strategic Air Command, the deputy ambassador to England from the United States, the head of the 2 British spy agencies, MI5, MI6 are there, a lot of Royal Air Force and other British military officers, Air Force, briefing the mission. And the mission is going to be 9 hours and 45 minutes because we're going to have to go around Portugal through Gibraltar, all the way in, all the way down to the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula to film the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, and then come back. And briefing takes place. I asked the deputy ambassador if I have a problem in the Middle East, where do you want me to land for sensitivity? And this guy turned absolutely white. He said, what do you mean, problem? I said, I'm not concerned about the threats, but airplanes sometimes develop problems. And basically the answer to us was figure it out yourselves where you ought to go. You cannot go to Israel, you can't go to Saudi Arabia, and Turkey does not want you. So figure out where you can go. About that time, one of the heads of MI5 or MI6 asked, well, what does your family know about this? And I said, well, my wife knows I'm on my way to England. And she gave me a hug and kiss as I was leaving and said, I don't want to hear about you on television or in the newspaper, which is exactly what we wanted. But unbeknownst to me, on that Sunday when we were getting stuff together, the colonel in charge of the operation had tried to find me, had called the house and had talked to my 7-year-old daughter. Well, she said she didn't know where I was, which was true. And then she told him, I can't take a message. Now we're in this meeting. And John and I tell them, so, you know, we really keep this low key. We don't really share much with the families because that's the name of the game. And all of a sudden, the colonel goes, no, Buzz, I got something to share with you. And oh, yes, sir. And he said, well, I called at your house on Sunday trying to find you. And I said, well, did our daughter say this was Captain Carpenter's home? Yes, she did. And I asked her where you were, and she didn't know where you were. Ask her if you could take a message. No, I don't write very well. I can't take a message. So he said, I asked her one more time, do you know where your father is? And in a whispery voice in the phone, she says, No, but I think he's out spying. And the whole room just absolutely roared with laughter. And John and I looked at each other and said, you know, we've been compromised. This may be our last flight. So there was some family humor or things that happened just because of these relationships. And we didn't give our kids credit. There was probably a lot of talk going on all the time on what their dads were doing. Next.
Oh, that's a fabulous story. I would have a hard time keeping a secret, I think, if my job was that cool. I'm going to end on one more question here.
Okay.
What feeling do you have when you see an SR71? When you come to the Cosmosphere and you see the plane that you piloted here in our lobby, what kind of feeling does that emote?
It's a very emotional feeling. You know, there's movies out there that talk about the airplane getting under your skin. It really did. It was such a privilege to have the opportunity to fly the airplane and all you went through to be able to do that. And it was a pleasure, but it was also, I flew over 65 operational missions. And when you realize that you were bringing back critical information for our government and other governments to use to hopefully in the pursuit of peace. And this airplane was able to do that for the 25 years of its life. So it almost has a personality. And there were airplanes that did have personalities. Your airplane was one of the ones I liked to fly. I only flew it a couple times before it went into storage. There were some airplanes like at the Smithsonian that I flew 10 missions, including the president's mission, that always flew the way I wanted it. There were other airplanes that just were a nightmare. Caused me all kinds of maintenance issues. Ironically, the one that was worse for me was the one that set the world speed record of 2,193 miles an hour, which is still the fastest airplane in the world. So thank you, everybody, for supporting the Cosmosphere. I look forward to the time to visit and work with.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And to those online, thank you for joining us. Watch for next month, third Thursday, 9 to 10 o'clock. We'll be in the same place.
Thanks, Carla. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, sir.